Hi, friends. I'm Sharon, and I'd like to open some Advents with you today. But first, let me tell you about the one big improvement that I think I've made. I try to do, if not one new thing every time I make a video, but I try to improve a little bit each time. And this time, I've got a microphone. Fancy, fancy. I hope this helps you hear me better. And I hope my lips match up with the sounds I'm making a little better. We'll see. Big spoiler alerts for Passiondale Tea Advent Calendar. Actually, I don't know how much of a spoiler it is because I think today might be the 18th or so, and I'm on day 13. So that's not much of a spoiler. But definitely big spoilers for the Woolen and Nosh sock advent calendar because I am caught up on it. I make sure I have my knitting time every day, even if I don't get to my tea time. The tea today, which I was really excited about because I like fruity teas. Today's tea is Tazo elderberry blackberry, which I thought would have a lot of punch. And it's dark, so I really thought it would taste more berry-y. It doesn't really. I don't think it really tastes like anything. I did put a little bit of honey in it, like a little bit of honey. This is a small mug, one of my favorite mugs. It's a perfect shape. The handle is fantastic. I can put 3 fingers in there. It's got this beautiful full hip shape, and it has really good mouthfeel. When I was choosing my mug to buy, the artist actually let me put my mouth on the mugs. Probably not a great idea. Oh well, I chose this one. It's the best. Anyway, the cup is small enough that I don't need a lot of honey. I put just a teeny tiny bit of honey in. Yeah, really can't taste anything. But let's look at knitting then. Like I said, I have done a lot since my last video. And look at this gloriousness. Oh, so many colors. So many beautiful colors. We've gotten into the purpley pinks, which makes me super happy. I love a good purpley pink. And it shouldn't be very long before I get to the next color, and we'll do that together. In a previous video that is in the sock knitting playlist, I talked about the pros and cons of the different types of needles that you can use to knit socks. DPNs and circulars and 2 circulars and itty bitty circulars and things like that. Today I want to talk about the size of your needles that you may want to choose to knit socks with. And when I say the size of the needles, I'm talking about how wide the actual needle is, the needle that you're using, not the length of your circulars. If you are doing magic loop, I would say the minimum length that you want is a 36 inch. I prefer a 42, so I can get nice big loops, and I can use those for hats and for other round things of different circumferences. So let's talk about the size of the tips. I had mentioned that I usually use size 1 US needles for my socks. Those measure, and I did measure them because I'm a nerd and I have a set of digital calipers that I use to measure my knitting needles with because I don't trust size numbers. The US sizes and the UK sizes are slightly different. They vary between knitting needles and crochet hooks. And I just, I like to be a little more precise. So I want to measure it. I want a millimeter number. So the US ones that I use are 2.25 millimeter. I had also mentioned that this sock yarn is a little thicker than the sock yarn I usually make socks with. So I went up a size. I went up to a size US 2, which is a 2.5 millimeter. So only a quarter of a millimeter larger, and it makes a huge difference. When I looked up a chart that converted millimeters to size numbers, size 2 can also be a 2.75 millimeter needle. And the difference between 2.25 and 2.5 millimeters when you're knitting is a huge difference. So the difference between 2.25 millimeters and 2.75 millimeters is just absolutely dramatic. So if you're buying needles and you're looking at the size numbers, size 1 or 2 or 0 or even 3 or double lot, make sure you're looking at the millimeter numbers as well. And with that, we have this amazing. I thought these I thought this green down here was pretty bright, but this one is it's a little bit darker, but wow. Oh, it's going to look so dramatic against this pink. Pink and green. Love pink and green together. Anyway, make sure you're looking at the millimeter numbers. So where should you start? By the time most people are interested in knitting socks, they know if they are a loose knitter or a tight knitter. If you don't already know if you're a loose knitter or a tight knitter, maybe talk to someone about it. Take a piece of your knitting to the local yarn shop. Ask one of your friends who knits, and they can feel the fabric and tell you if your stitches are tight or your stitches are loose. If you seem to be right on grade, for instance, if you pick up a skein of yarn at the yarn store and it says to knit this yarn on size 7 to 9 needles, and you use a size 8 needle and your fabric comes out beautifully, then you are an on gauge knitter. You are neither too tight nor too loose. If I were an on gauge knitter, I would probably start with a 2.25 millimeter needle for sock yarn. If you are a loose knitter, you will need to use smaller needles because the smaller your needle, the smaller your stitches. So if you're a loose knitter and your fabric comes out all loosey goosey, you want to compress that fabric a little bit. So you want to go to a smaller needle. So you may want to start with a 2 millimeter needle, or maybe even a 1.75 millimeter needle. That quarter of a millimeter, that half of a millimeter will make a big difference. If you are a tight knitter, if you can barely get your needle into that next stitch, then you want to go up a needle size or two. So you may want to start with a 2.5 millimeter or 2.75 millimeter, or maybe even a 3 millimeter sock needle. And unfortunately, it's going to take some experimentation to figure out exactly what size needle you're going to want to use, because also your yarn is going to change. This yarn is thicker than the sock yarn that I usually come across. So I had to change my needle size. The other thing that will affect your gauge is the material that your needles are made of. I get a completely different gauge with wooden needles, bamboo needles, and with metal needles. I knit quite a bit looser on metal needles. I think because the yarn tends to slide over the needles more. So take those things into consideration when you're buying your first set of sock needles. And if you don't like the fabric you're getting from the set of needles that you buy, then try a different set. And yes, that costs money, but there are some really inexpensive knitting needles out there now. Some people are interested in the interchangeable circular needles for knitting socks. I do not think the interchangeables come in sizes that are applicable for sock yarn because the needles are so thin that they can't really get the little screw part into them. If you find some, great. I love interchangeables. I love being able to have whatever size circular needle I want at pretty much any time. And I could be wrong about the sock needle thing, but I haven't seen them. If you find them, please let me know because that would be a valuable resource. All right, the screen is looking great. I'm very excited about it. Let me finish that up real quick. Coming up on my dark charcoal stripe, so I'll be done knitting soon. And I realized you may be wondering what all this fussiness is going on my sock here. This is where I will put my heel. I'm going to do an afterthought heel. And don't you worry, I will do a whole video about that. I have some waste yarn here where I knit one row where I'll put the heel, and then I have two lifelines out of dental floss. Really crappy dental floss. I don't think it's going to work out. We'll see. But that's where I'll put my heel afterwards. And the other thing I have going on are these safety pins. I use those to quickly count how many rows I've knit because I like my socks a certain height. And instead of trying to count all of these 40, 50, 60 rows of knitting every time I want to count it, I put a safety pin every 10 rows. So 10, 20, 30, that's about 40. I'm coming up on 50, which is where I like to start doing a little bit of an increase to fit my calves better. That's the thing that I really like about knitting socks is that you can take most patterns and add or subtract fabric where you need to. I need more space around my calves. I need more space around my heels to be able to get the sock on easily. And I can just add that in. You might want to knit a regular sock first before you go adding and subtracting. But if you already know that you have wide feet or skinny calves, then you can kind of, I wouldn't say do it on the fly, but you can definitely do it with a little bit of planning. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm glad I got some time to sit down and knit and have a cup of tea. And I hope to see you next time. So long. Hmm. Hmm. I got no turntables, just a microphone.